Hi, friends. This is your pal Scott Garibay, and today we are going to talk about Dungeons and Dragons in the era of the emotional revolution. And I want to talk today about the nature of the non player character in relationship to the Dungeon Master and exactly what the non player characters are uh, in a new understanding, considering a new understanding of Dungeons and Dragons new goal. All right. I'm gonna actually describe emotional revolution, why we're there, what we now understand about player characters, and then how that demands a re-examination of non-player characters in relationship to dungeon masters. Okay. So emotional revolution. What is the emotional revolution? The emotional revolution is the era of Dungeons and Dragons we are in right now. The first 50 years of Dungeons and Dragons was devoted to fun, and it was defined by the following statement. It was said everywhere. It was even said by the Dungeons and Dragons design team, but it was wrong. It was wrong. It's 100% wrong. All right, so what was it, right? So what was said? So it was said, in my humble opinion, absolutely wrong. So what was said? If everybody at the table is doing it right, if everyone at the table is having fun, you're doing it right. Okay, and you there is the dungeon master. This Why was this wrong? Well, first of all, we all should know this is wrong from the beginning. Why on earth should six people be coming to a table and it's insisted that they all have the same experience? Right? That should have been a clue right there that it was fundamentally wrong. So a guy much smarter than me came along, and in my humble opinion, with just a few statements, right, which were really encapsulations of what he was doing in Dungeons and Dragons, right, and massive statements. So a guy much smarter than me, B. Dave Walters, the second best dungeon master in the world, said the following. He said, "My goal is to evoke emotion, and if someone at the table is feeling something, it's a success," right? Complete redefinition of the goals of Dungeons and Dragons. One, not everybody has to have the same experience. In fact, we could leave players behind, right? There might be players who feel nothing at the table, but if one person at the table felt something real, that's a success, right? B. Dave Walters is saying this, right? Then, and so he's saying the point of Dungeons and Dragons is to evoke emotion. Well, how far? How far do we evoke emotion? To the point of psychological relief, right? He actually said it's cathartic. You just get it out. You get it out, right? How far do we evoke emotion? Literally to the point of psychological relief. That's what catharsis is. Catharsis definitionally is psychological relief of strong emotions. So B. Dave Walters comes and in my opinion, is the first person across the figurative battle line, the virtual battle line against fun, and saying that evoking emotion is the goal of Dungeons and Dragons. And that puts us, in my humble opinion, today in the emotional revolution, right? And so you get to choose, right? Are you going to go find a dungeon master who insists that everybody at the table has the same experience, exactly the same experience, and there's no variation, right? Uh, or are you going to go to someone who can literally help you evoke any emotion at any frequency, at any intensity? Whoa, right? That's different, right? And who can actually help you achieve a psychological relief. That's incredible. That's like a complete redefinition, right? Okay, once we understand we're in the emotional revolution, that completely redefines the relationship between the player and the player character. Okay, what is that relationship? That is uh, that the player character is now an emotional vessel, okay, and an emotional shield, so that the player doesn't get blasted with the emotions at full intensity, right? It's always split between the player character and the player, okay? So we now understand emotional revolution. We now understand the new relationship between player and player character. right? Also, this now means that no one is allowed to use backup characters, in my humble opinion, because that would be disgusting, right? Like if you're going to say, "Oh, I've journeyed all this way with this emotional shield, this emotional vessel that has helped me carry emotions. It's a piece of paper. I'll throw it away and put another one in within 5 seconds, rather than stepping away from the table and taking days, weeks, or months to unpack the emotional journey I've had with this player character." Uh, Backup characters become disgusting, absolutely disgusting, right? Completely inappropriate at any table, in my humble opinion, right? All backup characters are now is simply an identifier of bad dungeon masters and bad players. Okay, all right. So let's set all that on a shelf. Now, what is the relationship between the dungeon master and the non-player character? Now, here's the kicker, right? If your player character is an emotional vessel and an emotional shield, right? You are preserving it so that you have the ability to evoke these emotions, right? Because if you're going through some meat grinder or some West March game, right? You can't use those as emotional vessels. All they are is mechanical rules vessels, right? For players who really should be playing video games or war games, who really don't understand at all why Gary progressed from war games to role playing games. Okay, all right. So that's we're past that, right? Like we can leave those players. We can leave those players. I don't want to say behind. I think it's better to say leave them with our worst dungeon masters. We leave them with the dungeon masters have not arrived yet, right? At being a good dungeon master. They're dungeon masters. They're not good dungeon masters. They certainly aren't great dungeon masters. They're just dungeon masters. Let's leave those players with them, right? Don't leave them behind. Leave them with the worst dungeon masters in the community, right? Because they don't deserve any more, right? Okay, so yeah. All right. Now, dungeon masters do not have the same relationship, right? They can't preserve non-player characters the way players have a duty and obligation to preserve their player characters, right? They have a deep relationship, an emotional bond, right? Whereas a dungeon master may need to murder a non-player character literally as the opening introduction of that player character, right? Now, this gets really wild, right? Because we cannot, I don't think it's even safe to say that a non-player character is an emotional vessel, and they certainly can't be an emotional shield, because dungeon masters whip through them so fast and use them through such a wide array of purposes that if they are emotional vessels, that truly is a level. I think that would be dangerous, personally, right? I think if dungeon masters cannot use non-player characters as emotional vessels, because one, I think they'll give a very bad role-playing experience to the people who are actually at their table, right? It's not a productive use of a non-player character. So then let's ask the question, what are non-player characters? If they're not emotional vessels and they're not emotional shields, which I think we can agree they're not, I'm more than willing, if anybody thinks I'm wrong there, that they are, I'm willing to hear that in the comments below. All right. Okay. Then what are they, right? Here's what I think they are. Here's what I think they are now, okay? Here's what right now I think they are. That's the best way to say this. All right. I think they are narrative tools and narrative vessels. Narrative vessels first. They are vessels that narrative is poured into, right? So, and not just, and I use that term narrative a lot because I think story is too small to actually capture what Gary Gygax actually accomplished. He accomplished an incredible amount with Dungeons and Dragons. Before this, stories were extremely limited. They were created by one source, right? And then they were shared with a wide audience, very wide impersonal audience, right? So the stories were quite impersonal, really couldn't convey much to the experiencer. They were extremely limited, right? Whereas what Gary Gygax did was he created a new form of human narrative that is where the story is, yeah, I'll use that term here. The story is delivered from the primary source, the dungeon master, to the player character who's a secondary source that can control the narrative, control the story. And then both of them are interrupted by fate itself through the math rocks, right? And so that creates this new type of story, which I call the narrative, right? The Gygaxian narrative, right? So once you arrive at the Gygaxian narrative, now at this point, right, that is a new type of story that is spiky and difficult to hold, right? Difficult to even perceive, difficult to predict, right? But also far more powerful and far more capable of giving an emotional response to anyone at the table, because the dungeon master can adjust literally at the raise of an eyebrow of a single person in the audience. Also, get this is the first time in history that the author can see the reader, air quotes, literally as the story is being created. That's never happened. It did happen with shamans, right? And actually, yeah, that's a good point. But there it was a tribe. But most tribes were around 150 people. Again, too large of an audience to see everybody, right? But, oh my gosh, we are kind of modern shamans. It's pretty profound. Yeah, so now this story can literally, the creator of the story can respond to the audience directly, literally within 1 second, within a fraction of a second, within a half a second. A dungeon master can change the course of the story. This means these stories are like nothing that humans have ever experienced before, nothing humans have ever dealt with. It is just simply a completely different level of emotional vector, right? The amount of emotions, the array of emotions that can be delivered is truly astounding, right? Once we realize all that, I believe where that lands us with the non-player character is they are a narrative vessel. They carry the Gygaxian narrative, right? A good portion of it, right? Of course, some of the Gygaxian narrative is being held within the player characters, right? A good portion of it, right? But I think the best description of a non-player character is first narrative vessel, right? Narrative is poured into them and they hold narrative, right? And get this, just like any other vessel, the vessel could determine how it flows out, right? But it also, you could have a situation where the vessel is burst if there's too much narrative within it. That's pretty interesting. All right, so you have all that happening, right? And then at that point, also, I think we need to acknowledge that non-player characters are narrative tools. All right, so let's talk about them as a narrative tool. Basically, Gygaxian narrative is progressing, and there's momentum happening, right? But it might start to go in the wrong way. What would be the wrong way? I think something that would be too upsetting to one of the player characters to one of the players at the table, or something that would be socially unacceptable, or something that would be socially dangerous, right? So at this point, a dungeon master can bring in a new non-player character to force the narrative in a different direction, right? To take some of the narrative, put it into the non-player character, and then change the direction of the narrative, okay? And so that is a non-player character as a narrative tool, okay? And I also think non-player characters can allow Dungeons & Dragons to tell stories that were never possible with with shaman tales. Never possible. And I think the reason, and it's interesting though, shamans, they use divination and they literally rolled bones. We may be just a new form of shaman. The dungeon master may not simply be a new form of shaman. I appreciate your patience with this concept. Yeah, it is possible that we might be the first. That's interesting. I have to think about the relationship between a dungeon master and a shaman. That's very interesting to even consider. All right. Non-player characters are tools, right? And I think they can help. And I do believe, actually, I know for certain, we can tell stories with Dungeons and Dragons that can achieve different goals than were ever possible with print or with any print secular project, any secular book, or that could be showed on the screen, right? Because those are extremely impersonal. They're written literally separated from the audience. No one in the audience is there at the creation, right? Which all of this really makes me wonder. We need to start thinking about how Dungeons and Dragons is similar to Shaman Tales and similar to plays, because those are stories being told in the presence of the audience itself. It's really interesting, very interesting. But I think the important part here is we have to understand non-player characters are, at this point, our best understanding of them is narrative tools and narrative vessels. What is the relationship of the dungeon master to the NPCs? I do not have the bandwidth, I don't have the time within this video to answer that question. But we can proceed to answer that question now that we have determined what non-player characters are. Okay? In my humble opinion. Every single word that you just heard in this video is my humble opinion. Nothing more, nothing less. The important part is when I get to hear your humble opinion, when you get in the comments and send your traffic. Please consider liking and subscribing, and have a fetch millennium.